Imagine this scene. It's 1478. Within the decaying remains of a church in occupied Albania, a unit of Ottoman janissaries, the most brutal, elite fighting force on the planet, are acting like absolute madmen. They've just demolished a marble tomb with heavy sledgehammers. They're not hunting for treasure or precious stones. They're digging through dirt and decomposition, fighting over each other to tear apart the skeleton lying within. One soldier grabs a finger bone, another stuffs a rib into his coat. They genuinely hold the belief that these remains possess magical powers. They think that carrying a fragment of this corpse will render them immune to bullets. This isn't the burial place of some obscure holy man. This is the final resting spot of George Kastrioti, better known as Skanderbeg. And even a full 10 years after his passing, the mighty Ottoman Empire is so profoundly terrified of this individual that they are literally violating his grave, hoping to absorb his strength. How could one single man inflict such a deep-lasting psychological wound on a global superpower? How did a child, ripped from his homeland and raised in the enemy's palace, manage to become the empire's greatest commander, only to flip the script and bring the whole thing crashing down from the inside? Before we jump headfirst into these overlooked stories of perseverance and resistance, if you're deeply interested in uncovering the hidden realities of history, go right ahead and pound that like button and subscribe for more in-depth explorations. And please, take a moment to drop a comment down below telling us where you're watching from. I think it's absolutely amazing that we can investigate these ancient events together, linked across different lands and eras, all motivated by a common hunger to comprehend the past. To truly understand the intense fury at the heart of this tale, you first need to comprehend the deep violation that started it all. The Ottoman Empire didn't just sweep in and seize territory. They harvested children. It was known as the fearsome, the blood tribute. Ottoman officials would kick down doors in Christian settlements, inspect the young boys like they were livestock, and drag the strongest ones away to be brainwashed into the Sultan's elite janissary corps. In 1423, the recruiters came for a very special target. They didn't want a commoner's child. They demanded a prince. They demanded the youngest son of John Kastrioti, a defiant lord who had been a constant headache for the Sultan for many years. The boy's name was George. He was only 18 years old. The tragedy ran deeper than just the abduction. George had 3 older brothers, Riposh, Stanisha, and Constantine. They were also taken as hostages to ensure their father's cooperation. But they never returned home. They died while in Ottoman captivity. Rumors persisted that they were poisoned on the Sultan's direct orders. George Kastrioti was the last son left breathing, isolated and alone in the enemy's camp. Just imagine the cold, simmering rage that must have burned inside that young man. He was trapped in the court of the very people who had killed his brothers. But he didn't crack. He didn't revolt. He adjusted. The Ottomans drilled him relentlessly in archery, sword fighting, and military tactics until they were certain they had erased his past. He converted to Islam. They gave him the name Iskander, meaning Lord Alexander, for 20 years. He put on their uniform. He led their cavalry. He governed their provinces. He became the Sultan's favorite hunting dog, eating from his hand, quietly waiting for the cage door to be accidentally left open. He played his part so perfectly that nobody ever noticed the blade he was keeping hidden behind his smile. He was biding his time, waiting for absolute mayhem. That mayhem finally arrived on November 3, 1443, at the Battle of Niš. The Hungarian crusader John Hunyadi was tearing through the Ottoman ranks. The battlefield was a complete slaughterhouse, thick with smoke and filled with the screams of dying horses. This was the instant Skanderbeg had been anticipating for 2 decades. He didn't attack the enemy in front of him. Instead, he gave a signal to 300 trusted Albanian cavalrymen in his unit, men who had been quietly waiting for his order. They stopped battling the enemy ahead. They turned their horses. completely around. But Skanderbeg wasn't simply making a break for it. He needed a specific key. In the chaos of the retreat, amidst the panic, Skanderbeg hunted down the Sultan's chief secretary, the guardian of the imperial stamp. He dragged the frightened official into the shadows of a tent and held a knife to his throat. He didn't demand gold. He demanded a firman, an official imperial command, granting him control of the fortress of Krujë. The secretary, shaking with terror, wrote out the false document. Skanderbeg grabbed the paper and killed the man immediately. No witnesses. No loose ends. He then rode like a man possessed for 7 straight days, crossing enemy territory, talking his way through military checkpoints, using his stolen documents and his still recognizable general's uniform. When he finally reached Krujë, the unconquerable fortress, guarding his homeland, he didn't bother with a siege. He simply walked up to the main entrance. He handed the forged letter to the Ottoman governor. The Sultan's seal was genuine. The governor bowed, packed his belongings, and handed Skanderbeg the keys to the most important castle in the Balkans. It stands as one of the greatest cons in the entire history of warfare. That very night, Skanderbeg walked the ancient defensive walls. He personally tore down the Ottoman crescent flag. In its place, he raised a red banner bearing a black, double-headed eagle, the emblem of the father he had lost, and the brothers he couldn't save. Then, the night of knives began. Skanderbeg's men, helped by locals who had been waiting in the darkness, quietly murdered the entire Ottoman garrison while they slept. By sunrise, the Sultan's loyal wolf had vanished. The dragon of Albania had risen from the ashes, and he was standing on a pile of Ottoman dead, daring the greatest empire on earth to come and try to reclaim it. The morning after the bloody purge at Krujë, the excitement faded, and a harsh truth began to set in. Skanderbeg stood on the battlements, staring east toward the sunrise and toward the unavoidable retaliation. He understood the Ottoman war machine better than anyone alive. He knew that even now, in Edirne, the Sultan wasn't simply angry. He was already making calculations. The plans for an invasion were being drawn up. The supplies were being packaged. The massive cannons were being forged, and the death sentences were being prepared. Skanderbeg now possessed the castle. But he did not yet possess a nation. In 1443, Albania simply didn't exist as a unified country. It was a broken collection of constantly quarreling principalities. You had the Dukajini clan up north, the Thopia family in the middle, the Mizaka. Down south, these noble houses spent more energy fighting each other over grazing land and river boundaries than they ever did worrying about the Turks. They were proud, stubborn, and deeply mistrustful of any stranger. And to them, Skanderbeg was the ultimate outsider. Yes, he carried the blood of the Kastrioti line, but to them, he looked like a Turk. He wore Ottoman silks. He fought with a curved scimitar. He carried the very scent of the enemy. To the local lords, he wasn't a liberator. He was a dangerous unknown factor, a man who had spent 20 years dining with the devil himself. Skanderbeg knew he couldn't simply order these men around. He would have to earn their loyalty. He couldn't defeat them. He had to bring them together. On March 2, 1444, he pulled off his second brilliant move. He invited every major Albanian prince to the city of Lejë. He picked this location with careful thought. Lejë was under the control of the Republic of Venice neutral ground, where no single warlord had the advantage. It was a diplomatic safe zone. Picture the scene inside the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion. The lords arrived with their personal guards, hands resting on their sword handles, glaring at each other with the weight of ancient conflicts. They fully anticipated Skanderbeg to demand their complete surrender. They expected him to crown himself king. But Skanderbeg did something completely unexpected. He didn't request their lands. He didn't ask for their taxes. He stood before them a man who truly connected two different worlds, and talked not about ruling them, but about simple, shared survival. He painted a vivid picture of what was heading their way. He described the Janissary corps, the enormous artillery trains, the sheer, crushing scale of the Ottoman horror that was already advancing toward their valleys. He made them understand that their minor arguments over sheep and villages were completely insignificant when facing an event that could wipe them all out. He famously declared, "I have not brought you liberty. I found it here among you." It was a masterful psychological move. He redefined the entire struggle, not as his own private rebellion, but as their collective, unavoidable defense. The outcome was the formation of the League of Laju. It was a military alliance, the first time in history that these mountain clans agreed to fight under a single shared banner. They voted Skanderbeg as captain general, their supreme commander. They agreed to provide men and supplies, but they kept their local independence. It was a delicate coalition, kept together by one man's enormous charisma and the constant shadow of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Skanderbeg finally had an army, but it was a tiny one. Even with the combined strength of the League, he could only gather perhaps 15,000 to 18,000 fighters. The Ottomans, on the other hand, could put together armies of over 100,000. In a traditional direct confrontation on an open plain, the Albanians would be destroyed in under an hour. So, Skanderbeg threw out the traditional playbook and completely rewrote the rules of combat. He examined the geography of Albania, the sharp limestone peaks, the tight, winding mountain passes, the thick, shadowy forests, the fast-flowing rivers, and he understood that the land itself was his greatest friend. He converted his mixed group of farmers and shepherds into a lightning-fast guerrilla force. He removed their heavy, clumsy armor. He instructed them to hit with incredible speed and disappear back into the wilderness before the enemy could even organize a response. He used the Kastrioti light cavalry who rode without stirrups, able to navigate goat trails that would have shattered the legs of heavier Ottoman war horses. He created a system of signal fires across the mountain peaks, building a communication network faster than any messenger if an Ottoman column entered a valley. Skanderbeg knew about it before they could even pitch their tents. He turned the very landscape into a weapon, planning to drain the empire dry, not in one glorious fight, but through 1,000 small painful wounds. But the training period was short. In June 1444, the first genuine test arrived. Sultan Murad II sent Ali Pasha, one of his most seasoned commanders, with a force of 25,000 men. Their instructions were brutally straightforward: squash this uprising while it was still young, and bring back the head of the traitor. Iskender, Ali Pasha confidently guided his army into the Debre Valley. He was facing a peasant army led by a turncoat. He fully anticipated the Albanians to hide behind the walls of their fortresses. But Skanderbeg had no plan to hide. He laid a trap. This was the Battle of Torvial. Skanderbeg lured Ali Pasha into a tight valley, closely surrounded by steep, wooded slopes. The Ottomans spotted a small Albanian force blocking the road ahead and rushed forward, expecting an easy victory. They completely overlooked the thousands of men Skanderbeg had concealed in the forests on both sides of the valley. When the Ottomans were fully engaged, packed tightly into the kill zone, Skanderbeg gave the order. The woods erupted, archers and foot soldiers charged down the slopes, crashing into the Ottoman flanks like an avalanche. At the same moment, the retreating Albanian blocking force spun around and launched a fierce counterattack. It was a textbook double envelopment, carried out with almost flawless accuracy. The Ottoman army, despite its greater numbers and equipment, fell into complete panic. They couldn't move. Their cannons were useless in the mud and confusion. Ali Pasha barely escaped with his life. By nightfall, thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead in the valley. The news sent a tremor across Europe. A small rebel force hadn't just survived. They had wiped out an entire imperial army in open combat. In Rome, Venice, and Naples, Kings and church leaders sat up and paid attention. The traitor general had drawn first blood, but Skanderbeg didn't join the celebration, as his men cheered, and looted the abandoned Ottoman camp. He looked at the bodies of the Janissaries' men he might have once trained beside. He understood this was merely a reconnaissance force. He knew he had just woken a sleeping giant. The Sultan would not send a governor next time. He would come personally, and he would bring hell along with him. The humiliation at Torviol didn't simply anger Sultan Murad. It cut him deeply. The boy he had raised, the soldier he had personally instructed, had used Ottoman tactics to kill Ottoman sons. The Sultan finally realized that dispatching governors and pashas was no longer sufficient if you want to eliminate a dragon. You don't send a servant, you go yourself. In the spring of 1450, the ground in Albania began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the coordinated footsteps of 100,000 men. Sultan Murad II marched on Krujë with the biggest army the Balkans had ever witnessed. He brought with him the elite Janissaries, the Sipahi cavalry, and a terrifying new weapon that was transforming the nature of warfare: massive bronze cannons, forged in the foundries of Edirne, specifically built to reduce medieval stone walls to rubble. Skanderbeg watched this endless tide of steel approach from the high mountain peaks. He knew the numbers were impossible. He had fewer than 18,000 men total. If he attempted to meet the Sultan in the open field, his army would be crushed into dust. If he locked everyone inside the castle, they would either be starved out or buried under the debris. So Skanderbeg did the unthinkable. He divided his forces. He left a garrison of only 1,500 men inside the fortress of Krujë, under the command of his most trusted lieutenant, Count Vrana Conti. He gave Vrana a simple, terrifying instruction: hold the walls until you die. I will handle the rest. Then Skanderbeg took the remaining men and simply disappeared into the forests. He abandoned his own capital city, seemingly unprotected except for that tiny skeleton crew inside. When Sultan Murad arrived, he established a massive city of tents surrounding the castle. The siege started with a thunderous non-stop bombardment, day after day. The Ottoman trebuchets and cannons battered the walls of Krujë. The noise was overwhelming, a constant psychological torment for the men trapped inside. But Count Vrana stood his ground. The walls of Krujë were built directly into the living rock of the mountain. They were stubborn, just like the men defending them. Murad II attempted everything. He tried to storm the walls with endless waves of infantry, but the narrow approach to the castle rendered his vast numbers pointless. His men were channeled into a bottleneck and slaughtered by crossbow bolts and boiling oil. Then the Sultan attempted bribery. He sent a messenger to Count Vrana, offering him 300,000 aspers, a fortune that could purchase a kingdom if he would simply unlock the gates. Vrana didn't just decline. He reportedly told the Sultan he would rather consume the very stones of the castle than betray his leader. But the genuine nightmare for the Ottomans wasn't the stubborn castle in front of them. It was the ghost operating behind them. Skanderbeg was carrying out a masterful strategy of total psychological warfare. He and his light cavalry were hiding in the dense woods surrounding the Ottoman encampment. They didn't fight a single large-scale battle. They fought a recurring nightmare. Every single night, just as the Ottoman soldiers started to fall asleep, Skanderbeg would attack. He would launch lightning-fast raids on the edges of the camp, setting tents on fire, cutting off supply routes, killing guards, and screaming terrifying war cries before dissolving back into the darkness. The Ottomans couldn't rest. They couldn't search for food, because Skanderbeg's men would ambush any patrols that wandered too far. The hunters had become the hunted. The besiegers were now the besieged. Sultan Murad was caught in a living hell. He was losing thousands of men to disease, hunger, and those nightly terror attacks. He was an aging man, worn out and unwell, watching his supposedly unbeatable army slowly decay in the shadow of a castle that refused to surrender. He had completely underestimated the one element he couldn't destroy: the fierce personal devotion that Skanderbeg inspired in his followers. By October 1450, the winter snows were rapidly approaching. The Ottoman supply lines were completely wrecked. The camp had become a graveyard of illness and shattered spirits. Murad II, the man who had crushed Crusades and constructed an empire, was finally forced to admit failure. He looked up one last time at the defiant flag of the double-headed eagle waving over Krujë, gave the order to pack up, and started the long, shameful journey back to Edirne. He never recovered. The sheer disgrace and exhaustion of the failed siege of Krujë destroyed him. Within a few months, Sultan Murad II was dead. The news electrified all of Europe. A small, impoverished Albanian rebellion had not just survived. They had shattered the will of the Sultan himself. Skanderbeg was hailed as the champion of Christ by the Pope. The courts of Naples, Venice, and Hungary raised their glasses to his name. But in the mountains of Albania, Skanderbeg didn't celebrate. He knew something the rest of the world chose to overlook. Murad was dead, certainly, but his death meant the rise of his son. The new Sultan was a young man named Mehmed II. History would come to call him the Conqueror. And unlike his father, Mehmed didn't merely want to beat Skanderbeg. He wanted to wipe him from existence. Mehmed had grown up in the same palace as Skanderbeg. They knew each other personally, and that personal connection was about to transform this struggle into a decades-long personal war of hatred that would consume both of them. Skanderbeg had won the opening round, but the bell had just rung for the main event. They say the sharpest blade is the one held by a friend. Skanderbeg had survived the Sultan's cannons, the Janissary attacks, and the assassins sent under cover of darkness. But in 1455, he confronted a threat that no amount of armor could block the poison of betrayal from within. To grasp the seriousness of this moment, you need to meet Moisey Gullumi. Moisey wasn't just another officer. He was Skanderbeg's second-in-command. He was the finest commander in the League of Leju, a man who had ridden side by side with Skanderbeg through the fires of Torvial and Krujë. He was the only man Skanderbeg trusted enough to lead independent armies in the eyes of the soldiers. If Skanderbeg was the god of war, Moisey was his chief priest. But the new Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, was a deep student of human nature. He understood he couldn't defeat Skanderbeg on the battlefield, at least not yet. So he opened his massive treasury. He sent agents to Moisey with a temptingly simple proposal: why continue to serve a rebel prince in a barren, rocky wasteland when you could govern entire kingdoms for the emperor of the world? We'll never know exactly what caused Moisey to crack. Maybe it was simple jealousy of Skanderbeg's reputation. Maybe it was the complete exhaustion of an endless war. Or maybe it was just plain greed. Whatever the reason, Moisey Gullumi did the unthinkable. He switched sides. He rode to Istanbul, kissed the hand of Mehmed the Conqueror, and accepted command of an Ottoman army. Just imagine the shockwave that ripped through Albania. This wasn't just a desertion. It was a betrayal. The soldiers were deeply disheartened. If Moisey, the bravest among them, didn't think they could win, then who could? Mehmed II wasted no time. He sent Moisey back to Albania, this time at the head of 15,000 Ottoman troops. The mission was as much psychological as it was military. Moisey was to use his intimate knowledge of Skanderbeg's tactics to destroy him. It was the ultimate test, the master versus the student. The two armies met at the Battle of Oranik. Moisey was confident. He knew Skanderbeg's entire playbook. He understood how Skanderbeg used terrain, how he timed his devastating cavalry charges. He arranged his Ottoman troops to counter every single one of Skanderbeg's signature moves. But he forgot one crucial detail. Skanderbeg knew that he knew. Skanderbeg didn't fight the battle Moisey anticipated. He changed the entire flow of the engagement. He held his cavalry back. He pretended to have weakness in his center. He let Moisey believe he was outsmarting him, and just when Moisi committed his forces for what he thought was the finishing blow, Skanderbeg sprung his trap. It wasn't a complicated maneuver. It was a display of raw, crushing fury that Moisi had never accounted for. Skanderbeg led the charge himself, smashing through the Ottoman lines with such violent force that the Ottoman soldiers, despite their greater numbers, panicked and fled. Moisi was completely humiliated. His army was scattered. He barely escaped the slaughter, running back to the Ottoman court. But in Istanbul, failure is simply not tolerated. Mehmed II looked at the defeated traitor with undisguised contempt. Moisi suddenly understood he was a dead man walking. He had betrayed his brother for a throne, and now he had nothing, broken, penniless, and terrified for his survival. Moisi made a choice that was far more dangerous than any battle. He rode back to Skanderbeg's camp. He arrived at night, completely unarmed, with a rope tied around his neck, a traditional sign of absolute submission. He threw himself at Skanderbeg's feet, in front of the entire gathered army. The soldiers watched in stunned silence, their hands gripping their swords. They fully expected a public execution. In the medieval code of warfare, betrayal was the only unforgivable crime. Execution wasn't just expected. It was necessary to preserve order and discipline. Skanderbeg looked down at the man who had tried to have him killed. He saw the raw fear in Moisi's eyes. He saw the genuine remorse. And then Skanderbeg did something that shocked the entire Balkans more than any military victory ever could. He didn't pull out his sword. Instead, he reached down, took the rope from Moisi's neck, and lifted him to his feet. He embraced him. He kissed him on both cheeks in the traditional Albanian greeting, and then returned him to his full rank and titles. He is worth more to us alive and sorry than dead and forgotten. Skanderbeg reportedly told his shocked and angry officers. It was a gamble of insane proportions, but it paid off in ways no one could have predicted. By forgiving the unforgivable, Skanderbeg attached Moisi Gullumi to himself, with chains far stronger than iron. Moisi went on to serve Skanderbeg with obsessive, unshakable loyalty for the rest of his life, eventually dying while defending the league he had once betrayed. But more importantly, this stunning act of mercy sent a powerful message to every single soldier in the Albanian army. It told them they were fighting for something fundamentally different. They weren't fighting for a dictator who ruled by fear, like the Sultan. They were fighting for a leader who valued their lives and their chance at redemption more than his own pride. In a world defined by cruelty, Skanderbeg had turned mercy into a weapon, and that fierce, personal loyalty would be the only thing keeping them alive in the nightmare that was about to unfold. Because Mehmed the Conqueror was done playing games, the Conqueror himself was coming to finish what his father had started. By 1457, the world had permanently changed. The unthinkable had happened. Constantinople had fallen. Mehmed II was no longer just a sultan. He was now the Kaiser Iram, the Caesar of Rome, the conqueror of the world. The Byzantine Empire was nothing but ashes. The psychological message to all of Europe was brutally obvious: resistance is pointless. But in the rugged mountains of Albania, the resistance wasn't just still alive. It was actively irritating the hell out of the new conqueror. Mehmed finally understood that Skanderbeg was more than a simple annoyance. He was a symbol. As long as Skanderbeg continued to breathe, the myth of Ottoman invincibility stayed. Broken, this time, Mehmed didn't just dispatch an army. He sent a reflection. He entrusted the invasion force to Isaac Bey Evernose, a seasoned veteran. But the real danger wasn't the general. It was his advisor. Riding right beside Isaac Bey was Hamza Kastrioti. Hamza was Skanderbeg's own nephew. He was his own flesh and blood. He had been born and raised in these very mountains, fighting alongside his uncle for years. He knew every single mountain pass, every classic ambush spot, and the code for every signal fire. But Hamza was eaten up by a poisonous ambition. He genuinely believed that he should be the king of Albania, not his uncle, unlike Moisi Golemi, whose betrayal came from fear and desperation. Hamza's betrayal came from pure, cold, calculated hatred. He personally promised the Sultan that he would deliver Skanderbeg's head on a golden platter. The Ottoman army, 80,000 strong, poured into the Mat River Valley. They marched straight to the plains of Juggernaut. They fully expected Skanderbeg to attack. They anticipated the hit-and-run tactics, the night raids, the sudden volleys of arrows from the tree line, but they found absolutely nothing. Skanderbeg had vanished. His entire army had simply evaporated. The villages were deserted. The signal fires were cold. Rumors began to circulate among the Ottoman ranks. Spies reported that Skanderbeg had finally cracked, that his soldiers had abandoned him, and then that he had fled north to Venice in disgrace. Isaac Bey and Hamza waited. 1 week passed, 2 weeks passed, still nothing. The tension in the Ottoman camp started to ease. They actually believed the war was over without a single arrow being shot. They believed the dragon had finally lost his fangs. The iron discipline of the Ottoman camp quickly fell apart. Officers stopped setting strict guard schedules. Soldiers spent their days resting, celebrating their upcoming victory, and simply trying to escape the brutal summer heat. Hamza Kastrioti, arrogant and triumphant, assured the Ottoman command that his uncle was finished. It was the summer of 1457, and the heat was oppressive. On September 2nd, the sun was blazing directly overhead. The Ottoman camp was fast asleep. It was the siesta hour. Why bother keeping watch when the enemy has already fled the country? But Skanderbeg hadn't fled at all. For weeks, he had been hiding his entire army of 20,000 men in the dense, dark forests of Mount Tuinisht, which overlooked the entire plain. They had been living in complete silence. No fires, no talking, no movement, just waiting, watching the enemy get comfortable, watching them get careless. Skanderbeg was waiting for the perfect angle of the sun. He waited until the heat was at its absolute peak, when the enemy would be most sluggish and down, vulnerable. At midday, he finally gave the order. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. The Albanians poured out of the tree line, not as a disorganized mob, but in 3 perfectly disciplined columns. They didn't even shout their war cries until they were right on top of the tents. The sound of thousands of hooves thundering down the mountain must have sounded like the end of the world to the sleeping Turks. The chaos was absolute and immediate. Ottoman soldiers woke up to find Albanian swords already in their faces. They couldn't form lines. They couldn't even reach their horses. Isaac Bey's entire command structure collapsed in a matter of seconds. Hamza tried desperately to rally the troops, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. The Battle of Juggernaut was Skanderbeg's undisputed masterpiece. It was the most complete, decisive victory of his entire career. Between 15,000 and 30,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed or captured in just a few hours. The field was so thick with bodies that the local river ran red with blood. And in the middle of the carnage, Skanderbeg found exactly what he was looking for. His men captured Hamza Kastrioti alive. The meeting between uncle and nephew was very different from the emotional reunion with Moisi. There were no kisses, no tears of forgiveness. Skanderbeg just looked at the young man who had sold out his own family for power. Hamza was not executed. That would have been far too easy. He was imprisoned and eventually sent to Naples, where he was left to rot in a dungeon, far away from the land he had so desperately wanted to rule. Skanderbeg had just wiped out another imperial army. He had outsmarted and defeated his own blood. The victory at Juggernaut echoed across all of Christendom. The Pope called him Athleta Christi, the athlete of Christ. But as Skanderbeg wiped the blood from his blade, he knew this victory, as glorious as it was, carried a heavy price. He had publicly humiliated Mehmed the Conqueror, and Mehmed was not a man who ever forgave humiliation. The Sultan was done with proxies. He was done with generals. The next time the drums of war sounded, they would herald the arrival of the conqueror himself. The final ultimate duel was fast approaching. By 1461, Skanderbeg had achieved the impossible. He had finally secured his borders. The Ottoman armies, still licking their terrible wounds after the disaster at Juggernaut, had temporarily paused their invasions. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the valleys of Albania were quiet. Most men would have used this precious time to rest, to rebuild, to simply breathe. Skanderbeg packed his bags. He was going to war again, but this time he wasn't fighting for his own land. He was fighting for his personal honor. Years earlier, King Alfonso of Naples had been Skanderbeg's only reliable ally, sending grain and supplies when the rest of Europe offered nothing but thoughts and prayers. Now, Alfonso was dead, and his son, King Ferdinand, was completely surrounded by enemies. The French house of Anjou was tearing the kingdom of Naples apart, and Ferdinand was on the absolute brink of losing his crown. He sent a desperate plea across the Adriatic Eye. "Am besieged. Only you can save me." Skanderbeg didn't hesitate for a second. In the medieval world, an oath sworn was a bond of blood. He gathered 3,000 of his absolute best men and sailed for Italy. The arrival of Skanderbeg in Italy was like a wolf suddenly walking into a dog show. The Italian wars of the 15th century were often highly ritualized affairs, slow maneuvers. Heavy plate armor, polite sieges, and battles where knights were captured for ransom rather than actually killed. It was a gentleman's game, played by mercenaries who wanted to get paid, not die. Then came the Albanians. Skanderbeg's men, known as the Stratioti, were a profound shock to the entire Italian system. They didn't wear heavy plate armor. They wore light chainmail or hardened leather. They didn't ride heavy. Slow destriers, they rode swift, agile mountain horses, and they simply didn't play by the accepted rules. When the French heavy cavalry charged, expecting a glorious collision of lances, the Albanians simply scattered, circled around, and attacked the vulnerable flanks and rear with terrifying speed. The psychological impact on the French and their Italian allies was devastating. They were genuinely terrified of these demons who moved like smoke and struck like vipers. Skanderbeg's fearsome reputation had preceded him. This was the man who had single-handedly stopped the Ottoman Empire. Just the mere sight of his banner on the field was often enough to completely break the enemy's morale. At the Battle of Barletta, Skanderbeg effectively saved King Ferdinand's reign. He broke the siege, crushed the French rivals, and secured the throne for his ally. He was toasted and celebrated in the courts of Naples. He was given titles, land, and a generous pension for life. He could have easily stayed. He could have retired to a comfortable Italian villa, drinking wine and living out his days as a wealthy duke, far from the blood and snow of his homeland. But he didn't. As soon as the job was done, he turned and looked east, across the sea. He knew the silence from the Ottomans was a dangerous deception. He knew the storm was gathering once more. He returned to Albania in 1462, just in time. But this time, he desperately hoped he wouldn't have to fight alone. The new Pope, Pius II, was a brilliant and highly ambitious man. He was one of the very few European leaders who truly understood the existential threat of the Ottomans. He didn't just want to defend. He wanted to go on the offensive. He declared a new crusade. His plan was grand, and sweeping a massive Christian coalition would gather in Ancona, sail across the Adriatic, link up with Skanderbeg's army, and then march all the way to Constantinople. To drive the Turks out of Europe forever, Skanderbeg was even named the commander-in-chief of the Holy See's forces. For one brief shining moment, it seemed like the help Skanderbeg had prayed for his entire life was finally, actually coming. He mobilized his entire nation. He prepared the ports. He waited. But the crusade turned out to be a tragedy of errors. From the start, The European monarchs were far too busy squabbling with each other to send any real troops. The mercenaries who did show up in Ancona were undisciplined and woefully ill-equipped. And then came the final crushing blow. Pope Pius II died suddenly in Ancona in August 1464. With the Pope's death, the Crusades simply evaporated. The ships turned back. The mercenaries went home. The coin purses snapped shut. Skanderbeg stood alone on the shores of Dours, looking out at an empty, silent sea. The realization that hit him was bitter and absolute. No one was coming. There would be no great fleet, number army of knights, no salvation from the west. Europe was perfectly happy to praise him as their shield, but they would not stand beside him in the shield wall. He was completely alone. And the worst was yet to come. Mehmed II had finally finished his other conquests. He had expanded his empire in Trebizond, in Bosnia, in Wallachia. Now he turned his unblinking, undivided gaze back to the one jagged rock that still refused to sink. He was done with generals. He was done with proxies. In the spring of 1466, the ground shook. Once more, this time, it wasn't just an army. It was an extermination force, and marching at its head, under the golden standards of the prophet, was the conqueror himself. In the summer of 1466, the sun was blocked out, not by clouds, but by an endless cloud of dust. Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror, the man who had shattered the walls of Constantinople and ended the Ottoman Empire, was personally marching into Albania. He brought with him an army of 150,000 men. To put that terrifying number in perspective, the entire population of Albania at the time was likely smaller than the army that had come to kill them all. This wasn't a military campaign. This was a moving city of steel, fire, and absolute fury. Mehmed didn't just want to defeat Skanderbeg. He wanted to solve a psychological riddle that haunted him. He had grown up hearing stories of Iskander. He had studied his tactics obsessively. In many ways, Skanderbeg was the only man alive Mehmed truly respected. And that was exactly why he had to die. There could not be two suns in the same sky. Skanderbeg knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't stop this tidal wave. If he lined up his 15,000 men for a fair fight, they would be dead in 10 minutes. So, he made the kind of decision that only the hardest of leaders can bring themselves to make. He declared a policy of total scorched earth. He ordered the complete evacuation of the lands, but he didn't just move the people. He systematically destroyed the land itself. His own soldiers burned their own golden fields of wheat. They slaughtered their own livestock that couldn't be moved. They poisoned their own wells. When the massive Ottoman army finally arrived, they didn't find a land of milk and honey to plunder and sustain them. They found nothing but a wasteland of ash and eerie silence. Mehmed marched his enormous army through a graveyard of burnt crops. His already stretched supply lines were pushed to the absolute breaking point. Hunger began to gnaw at his troops before the first arrow was even fired. But Mehmed was not his father. He was colder, sharper, and possessed an iron will that would not bend. He pushed on relentlessly towards Krujë for the second time. In history, the White Castle on the cliff was surrounded, but this time, Mehmed brought cannons that made his father's artillery look like toys. He pounded the ancient walls day and night, without mercy. The garrison, led by the brave Tanush Thopia, held on with the grim desperation of men who knew there would be no mercy if they failed. Outside the walls, Skanderbeg played his familiar deadly game. He struck from the mountains, hitting the vulnerable Ottoman supply caravans, terrorizing their camps at night. But Mehmed had learned from his father's mistakes. He built heavily fortified lines around his entire camp to keep Skanderbeg's raiders out. He absolutely refused to be baited into chasing the Albanians into the treacherous woods. It was a brutal stalemate of titans. Frustrated by the stubborn defiance of Krujë, Mehmed looked for a softer target to vent his burning rage. He turned his eyes to the fortress of Svetograd. Svetograd was not Krujë. It was a smaller outpost, meant to protect the local civilian population, women, children, and the elderly who couldn't flee. The defenders of Svetograd held out bravely, but they were completely cut off from water. Dying of thirst, they eventually negotiated a surrender. Mehmed offered them a sacred, binding pledge: if they opened the gates, they would all be spared. Trusting the word of a sultan, they opened the gates. What followed is one of the darkest, most brutal chapters in the entire history of the Balkans. Mehmed the Conqueror, the sophisticated patron of the arts, the man who spoke 6 languages, broke his sacred word. He ordered the total massacre of the entire population of Svetograd. It wasn't just a killing. It was a brutal message written in blood. The soldiers were beheaded. The commanders were flayed alive. The women and children were either enslaved or simply butchered on the spot. Mehmed wanted Skanderbeg to see this. He wanted to scream, in the most graphic way possible, "This is the price of your resistance. You cannot save them." It was a moment of pure, concentrated psychological horror. Skanderbeg, watching helplessly from the mountains, must have felt a crushing, suffocating weight on his chest. Every day he continued to fight, his own people continued to suffer. The scorched earth policy was starving the Turks, yes, but it was also slowly starving his own people. The massacre at Svetograd showed, in the most horrific terms, that Mehmed was more than willing to completely depopulate the entire country, just to win. But Mehmed also had a serious problem. Winter was fast approaching. Despite the terror inflicted at Svetograd, Krujë simply would not fall. The scorched earth tactics were working. The Ottoman army was dying in droves from dysentery and starvation. The horses were eating tree bark. The mighty conqueror finally realized he was stuck in the same bloody mud that had trapped his father years before. In a fit of pragmatic rage, Mehmed made a strategic withdrawal. He couldn't possibly stay in Albania for the brutal winter, but he didn't leave empty-handed. Before he left, he ordered the construction of a brand new fortress right in the heart of Albania, planted firmly in the center of the main valley. He had it built in just 25 days, using the massive disposable labor force of his own army. He named it Elbasan, the fortress that dominates. This was Mehmed's parting gift. He couldn't conquer Skanderbeg in a single summer, so he would choke him slowly, methodically. Elbasan would serve as a permanent Ottoman military base, a knife held constantly and unyieldingly at Albania's throat. Mehmed marched back to Istanbul, publicly claiming victory because he had built a castle and slaughtered a village. But privately, deep down, he knew the truth. He had brought the full, terrifying power of the Ottoman Empire against one old man and a broken country, and he had utterly failed to break them. Skanderbeg descended from the mountains to find a ruined, smoldering land. The fields were black, the villages were empty and silent. The new fortress of Elbasan loomed in the distance like a tombstone. He had won the immediate battle, but he was slowly losing the long, grueling war of attrition. The decades of non-stop fighting were finally taking their toll. His beard was pure white. His body was a roadmap of scars. His allies were either dead or too distant to help. The dragon was still breathing, but the fire inside him was dimming, and Mehmed wasn't done. He would come back. He would keep coming back year after year until there was nothing left to burn. By the winter of 1467, Skanderbeg was 62 years old. In the 15th century, that was practically ancient. Most men his age were long dead or senile. Skanderbeg was still in the saddle, wearing armor that weighed as much as a small child, fighting a war that had consumed his entire adult life. But he knew the end was near, not because he was afraid of Mehmed, but because he looked at his country and saw it bleeding out, slowly dying. The scorched earth policy had saved them from immediate invasion, but it had also left his people starving. He needed money, he needed grain, he needed soldiers, so the old lion made one final desperate journey. He didn't ride to battle. He rode to Rome. Imagine the scene inside the Vatican. It was Christmas, 1467. The cardinals sat in their luxurious velvet robes, surrounded by the golden marble of the holy city. And into this opulent, gilded hall walked Skanderbeg. He didn't look like a prince anymore. He looked like a beggar general. His cloak was frayed and worn. His face was a deeply etched map of scars and sun damage from decades in the field. He stood before Pope Paul II and the assembled princes of Europe, and he didn't boast of his legendary victories. He pleaded with them. He told them with absolute conviction that Albania was the only dike holding back a vast ocean. He warned them with chilling accuracy that if his country fell, Italy itself would be next. He asked for troops. He begged for a crusade. He received thunderous, enthusiastic applause. The Pope once again called in the champion of Christendom. They gave him a ceremonial sword. They gave him a fancy helmet. They gave him some money, just enough to pay his troops for a few more months. But they did not give him an army. The European powers were far too busy squabbling over their own petty borders and rivalries to care about the storm gathering in the east. Skanderbeg returned to Albania with a heavy, defeated heart. He knew, with absolute, bone-deep certainty, that he was the only thing still standing between his people and complete oblivion. In January 1468, he called one last assembly of the League of Leju. He wanted to plan a new offensive against the hated Ottoman fortress of Elbasan. He was still plotting, still fighting, still believing, against all evidence, that he could somehow still win. But an assassin finally slipped past his guard. It wasn't a janissary or a poisoner. It was a mosquito. Skanderbeg fell violently ill. With malaria, the fever struck him hard, burning through the body that swords and arrows had failed to kill for 25 years. He was confined to a bed in Leju, the very city where he had first united the tribes all those years ago. As he lay dying, a rumor spread like wildfire that the Ottomans were crossing the border again. A raiding party was approaching Shkodër. Even on his deathbed, the old ingrained instinct kicked in. Legend says Skanderbeg tried desperately to rise, demanding his armor and his horse. He wanted to lead the charge one last time, but his broken body simply wouldn't obey. He collapsed back onto the sheets, his officers' men who had followed him through literal hell for decades stood around the bed, openly weeping. These were men who would charge into cannon fire without blinking. But seeing their seemingly invincible leader fade away in front of them completely broke them. Skanderbeg looked at them and gave his final orders. He didn't speak of vengeance. He spoke only of unity. He told them with his last breath that if they stayed together, they could never be broken. Unity was his dying prayer. On January 17, 1468, George Kastrioti Skanderbeg died. The moment his heart stopped, a strange, profound silence fell over the entire Balkans. The wailing of his soldiers was said to be so loud, drowned out the winter wind. There is a haunting legend about his horse. They say that Skanderbeg's white stallion, a beast that had carried him through his greatest victories, absolutely refused to be ridden by anyone else. After Skanderbeg died, the horse became wild with grief, refusing all food and water, until it eventually died of a broken heart. Whether the story is literally true or not, it tells you everything you need to know about the profound bond between the man and his lifelong war. But perhaps the most chilling reaction of all came from the enemy. When the news reached Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror did not celebrate. He did not throw a feast. He reportedly sat in absolute silence for a very long time. Then, he looked at his advisors and said a phrase that would echo through history. Asia and Europe are mine at last. Woe to Christendom, for they have lost their sword and their shield. The Sultan knew exactly what Europe was about to find out. The dragon was finally dead, and now the wolves would come to feast. Skanderbeg had been right. Unity was the only shield they had, and the moment he died, that shield shattered into 1,000 pieces. Without the dragon's immense charisma to hold them together, the League of Leju dissolved back into its bickering. Feuding clans, the Ducagini fought the Thopia fought the Venetians, and watching from the east, Mehmed the Conqueror smiled. The checkmate was finally visibly on the board. The Sultan didn't rush. He was patient. He methodically, systematically picked off the Albanian fortresses one by one. Krujë, the White Castle, that had defied his father and himself for decades, finally fell in 1478. The defenders, starving and out of ammunition, surrendered on the promise of safe passage. And once again, the Ottomans broke their word. The men were all massacred, and the women were sent to the slave markets of Istanbul. The ultimate symbol of resistance was washed in blood. But the final tragic act of this story didn't happen in Krujë. It happened in Shkodër. Shkodër was the very last major stronghold, a massive fortress perched on a rocky hill, defended by a combined force of Venetians and the last surviving veterans of Skanderbeg's original army. In 1478, Mehmed the Conqueror surrounded it and unleashed the heaviest artillery barrage the world had ever seen. The Ottoman cannons rained down stone balls, weighing hundreds of pounds onto the castle. Walls for weeks on end. The siege was horrific. The defenders were reduced to eating rats and boiling leather for soup, but they held out for months, repelling wave after wave of Janissary assaults. It was one last display of the same stubborn defiance that had reminded the Sultan of the old days, when Shkodër finally inevitably surrendered in 1479. The war was effectively over. Mehmed II walked through the ruined, blood-soaked gates of Shkodër. He had finally won. The Albanian flag, the double-headed eagle, was torn down for the last time. A crescent moon rose over the Balkans, would stay there, unchallenged, for the next 433 years. But before the final curtain could fall, a mass exodus began. Thousands upon thousands of Albanians, realizing that life under direct Ottoman rule would mean the death of their faith, their language, and their identity, fled desperately to the coast. They crammed onto Venetian ships, carrying nothing but their children and their precious memories. They looked back at their burning villages one last time and set sail across the Adriatic Sea to Italy. These traumatized refugees settled in southern Italy, in Calabria, Sicily, and Puglia. They were given land by the Kingdom of Naples, the very kingdom Skanderbeg had saved with his own hands years earlier. It was a final repayment of a blood debt. These people became known as the Arboreshu, and this is where the story takes a truly fascinating turn. Usually, when a people are conquered and scattered, they eventually assimilate. They forget, within a generation or two. They become Italian, or French, or German, but the Arboreshu did not forget. In their isolated, remote mountain villages in Italy, they essentially froze time. They kept their ancient language alive. They kept their epic songs alive. They kept their Orthodox liturgy alive. And most importantly of all, they kept the legend of Skanderbeg alive for over 500 years. While Albania itself lay crushed under the Ottoman yoke, forced to convert, forced to change names, forced to serve the very sultans who had hunted them, the Arboreshu in Italy were singing songs around their fires about the dragon who fought the empire. They became a living, breathing time capsule. Back in Albania, the Ottomans tried their absolute best to erase him from history. They converted his churches into mosques. They destroyed any statues they could find. That's ultimately why the Janissaries dug up his grave in Leju. It wasn't just for superstitious amulets. It was a calculated act to physically dismantle his existence. They wanted to make absolutely sure that George Kastrioti became nothing more than a forgotten ghost story. But you cannot kill a ghost story if people simply refuse to stop telling it, while the rest of Europe moved on to the glories of the Renaissance, discovering new worlds and forgetting the old warrior in the Balkans. The spirit of Skanderbeg went underground. It survived in the haunting songs of the grandmothers in remote Calabrian villages. It survived in the hidden whispers of the mountain tribes in northern Albania, who still refused to bow. The dragon was dead. The castles had fallen. But the idea of Skanderbeg, the unshakable idea that resistance is always possible. Even against the very greatest odds, that idea proved to be indestructible. And 4 centuries later, when Albania finally woke up to fight for its independence all over again, that very idea would be the spark that started the fire. So, what is the true, lasting legacy of George Kastrioti Skanderbeg? It is tempting to look at the map of 1479 after the fall of Shkodër and say that he failed. After all, the Ottoman Empire did eventually conquer Albania. They did rule it for the next 4 centuries. The castles he built and defended were all taken. The people he had protected were subjugated. In the cold, hard calculus of territory and conquest, Skanderbeg lost. But history is not just about who happens to hold the land at the end of the day. It is about time. For 25 crucial years, Skanderbeg acted as a human breakwater against the unstoppable Ottoman tidal wave. He stopped Sultans Murad II and Mehmed the Conqueror during the absolute peak of their power. Every single summer they spent bleeding in the rugged mountains of Albania was a summer they did not spend marching on Rome, Vienna, or Naples. Historians have argued for centuries about the what-ifs. If Skanderbeg had fallen in 1444, would Mehmed have crossed the Adriatic? Would St. Peter's Basilica in Rome have been turned into a mosque, just like the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople? We will never know for sure. But we do know this with certainty: Skanderbeg bought Western Europe decades of precious security. He bought them the invaluable time to breathe, the time to build, and arguably, the time to spark and nurture the Renaissance. While Italy was painting its masterpieces, Skanderbeg was painting the Albanian mountains red, just to keep them safe, and the world eventually recognized this profound debt. Today, you can find statues of Skanderbeg not just in Tirana or Pristina, but in Rome, in London, in Brussels, and even in Rochester Hills, Michigan. He was the subject of operas by Vivaldi and epic poems by Longfellow. He transcended his small, mountainous geography to become a universal archetype, the defiant underdog, the man who simply says no when the entire world screams submit. But perhaps his most enduring victory isn't found in the history books or the bronze statues. It is found in the flag. Look at the flag of modern Albania. It is the exact same blood-red banner with the black double-headed eagle that Skanderbeg raised over Krujë on that cold November night in 1443. It is one of the very few national flags in the entire world that is a direct, unbroken continuation of a medieval coat of arms. It survived 400 years of an Ottoman ban. It survived the bloody Balkan Wars. It survived 2 world wars and a brutal communist dictatorship. That flag is the ultimate, undeniable proof of his victory. He didn't just fight a war. He forged an identity so strong, so deeply ingrained, that half a millennium of empire building couldn't erase it. If you made it this far, thank you. We have traveled together from the brutal Janissary schools of Edirne to the burning, blood-soaked walls of Shkodër. If this story of resilience and defiance resonated with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. I have many more forgotten epics to share with you. And please, leave a comment below. Who is the Skanderbeg of your country's history? Who is the figure that truly defines your nation's spirit of resistance? I read every single comment, and I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective. In the end, Skanderbeg teaches us one hard, eternal lesson about freedom. Freedom is not a gift you are given. It is a fortress you have to build, stone by stone, and then defend day by day. It requires the cunning of a fox, the courage of a lion, and sometimes the sacrifice of everything you hold most dear. The Ottomans may have crushed the bones of the man to make their magic amulets, but they choked on his legacy, the dragon. of Albania died, but he never really left the battlefield. Picture this, it's today. The mountains of Krujë are silent. The cannons have long since rusted away. But if you listen closely to the wind blowing through those ancient valleys, you don't hear the sound of defeat. You hear the steady beat of eagle wings.